you that it's recording. Okay. My name is Lauren Obach. I'm your moderator today. I work for the Edith Wheeler Memorial Library. We are using AI-assisted closed captioning today. So if you find it distracting, has a really hard time with both me and Arthur's Long Island accents. So sometimes he gives you some really weird messages. So just feel free to turn that off by pressing the CC button at the top or bottom of your screen. I want to thank everybody for your patience last session. I was quarantined yet again with my 2 toddlers, so I was not able to make it unless you wanted just to hear screaming for an hour and a half, which I don't think you do. Thank you to Nicole, who is our new director, for stepping up last minute and handling those hosting duties. This series is brought to you by a co-sponsorship between the Monroe Historical Society and the Friends of the Library. Both of those groups are actually looking for volunteers to help out. So if you're interested in either of those, just shoot me an email and I'll get you connected to the person that you want to talk to. Today's session is number 6 of 7 in our Civil War series. From Atlanta to Appomattox. Our final session is going to be Wednesday, January 26th, and that will deal with the Reconstruction. We want during this session to have conversation and answer questions. The easiest way to do that is to put your question into the chat box. I can see that right away, and Arthur can see that right away. We can also see if you use the raise hand feature, we can get to those questions. We will stop periodically to ask if there are any questions. If you do choose to use your microphone, please just give us a heads up that you're going to be speaking, because there's a really big delay between when you start to speak and when we actually hear you. So sometimes you miss that first part of the question. As always, you can also email me after the session if you have questions, and I'll get those over to Arthur. I'm going to introduce our host, Arthur Gottlieb. Arthur is a political and military historian. He has also worked as a professional curator of naval history and the technical director of exhibits at the Intrepid. He was a member of the U.S. Coast Guard for 17 years and now works frequently with veterans as a certified senior advisor and counselor who offers pro bono services to soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. And he's here, he's here with his kitty today to present From Atlanta to Appomattox. Welcome.
I finally just grabbed her because what she likes to do, I can see she likes to run across the keyboard, you know, and which causes problems in live presentations. Sorry for the distraction. I love these cats. Anybody here have cats? Yeah, I know. Okay, go on. All right. Just quit while I'm ahead here. That was the best part of the program. Thank you for joining us last week and for all of our other programs up to this point. Last week we had I hope what you'll find was a treat, that I had a whole slide presentation on Monitor versus the Merrimack, or as you know, not really the Merrimack, but the CSS Virginia. So I hope you enjoyed that. Today, I want to go more understanding / philosophical with you, because it's very, very important to understand from Atlanta to Appomattox. The reason why I use photographs sometimes and sometimes I don't is quite deliberate. Today's one where I want to engage you on a mental level, on an emotional level, and creating a picture in your mind, I think, is going to be the best thing to do. So along with me, let's take a journey to the last year of the American Civil War into 1864 into 1865. And strategics, by the way, just so you understand, as long as we're talking about a military topic, when I'm talking about something strategic, I'm talking about in large terms about the goal of an operation, about a sweeping understanding of what you're trying to do with an army or several armies simultaneously, right, in the long game. Tactics is how you achieve that strategy's end, right? So what an army does, or what a soldier does for that matter, individually or as a group, as far as what they're doing with cannons, rifle fire, maneuver. That's all methods of tactics. Okay, whereas supposedly the politicians and the higher up generals are working on something called strategy. So the strategy in the American Civil War is for the North to get the southern states to not be rebellious anymore, right? Because that's what the North saw it as. They saw it as this massive rebellion. They saw it as not states that were really even legitimate as another country. The North never recognized the Confederacy as a country. They never recognized the leaders of the Confederacy as a legitimate government, right? The North only recognized the Southern states in forms of their being part of this giant rebellion. Okay, I guess today you would use the word insurrection. And it was just to be put down. There was never any question that if you acknowledged the Southern states as their own country, that would literally legitimize them. And that's something that the North, the Union, didn't want to do and never did. Okay, now the Army was a different story. The Confederate States of America had its own army, as you know, and several armies. And that was something, obviously, that was recognized as an entity. So Appomattox is where the war ends, right? Appomattox, if you look on a map, is this little place just west of and in between, right, Richmond and Petersburg, right? So we're talking about Virginia, which in many ways was the most important state strategically of the Civil War. And this is where the war comes to an end. It comes to an end militarily at Appomattox in 1865. And what happens is essentially the South surrenders to the North. And normally that wouldn't mean the end of a war, but for the Southern states, General Lee was so synonymous with the war itself, right? People followed General Lee. They didn't necessarily follow the president, Jefferson Davis, or anybody, the vice president of the Confederacy. They didn't follow those people. I mean, the picture of the Confederacy was General Lee. You know, so when General Lee surrendered his force at the Army of the Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse, everybody knew it was over. That was it. It wasn't like, okay, well, General Lee's army is defeated, but there are still other armies in the Confederacy that should continue carry on fighting. I mean, it was understood when Lee surrendered, he was such a person of such stature, of so much embodiment of the Southern cause, that his surrender to General Grant was literally synonymous with the war being over. Now, whenever we're talking about these things, like we are now, I would like you to use the lessons involved in things like what I was just talking about. Not that that was a lesson, it was more of an observation, fact, historical fact, and use it as a template for many of the things that have happened after the Civil War, right up to the present day, in the kind of rhetoric that's involved in things. And you can make up your own mind about, you know, what the conclusions of those things are. But as an instructional tool, as an educational tool, I mean, the Civil War is a massive learning tool to even understand where we are in terms that are being expressed today in politics. I give you okay. Somebody's got their mic on. If that's the case, then I'm going to ask you to either silence it or not talk while I'm talking, please. Um, I want you to use the examples that we're going to talk about in the Civil War and have talked about politically and emotionally and sociologically and philosophically, and use them as a template to try and understand some of the things that we're in today. I mean, during President Biden's speech yesterday, if you had a chance to listen to it or heard it afterwards, there were actually several references that overlap things that we're talking about today regarding figures of the Civil War, et cetera. Okay, and the kind of passions involved, I would say, are no less intense today than they ever were. So it tells us something about human nature, that if you have put all your eggs in a basket of understanding of what you want to be successful with, in other words, like the Confederacy, then what does it mean to lose? How devastating would that be? Is it even comprehensible to lose? All right, and just like any other war, at the end of a war, at the end of the Civil War, at the end of World War II, at the end of political campaigns, people felt as though they just can't go on if what they dedicated themselves to didn't come to fruition, because the life that's going to be remaining is something that they just can't comprehend. They don't want to live in what's going to be remaining since they've lost, right? So you have at the end of World War II, you have people who are real Nazis, many of which just decided to kill themselves, kill their whole families. Yeah, because how could you live in a world that didn't include the way that you saw the world, right? And it was incomprehensible. People had put all their eggs in one basket into a maximum effort, and then having lost, it's just inconceivable that the world is going to be like, for instance, at the end of World War II, the world's inconceivable if you're a Nazi, that now we're going to be run by Jewish bankers or communists or non-Aryans. You know, it was inconceivable if you were a real Nazi, you see. And at the same thing, at the end of the Civil War, it was inconceivable that you'd be in a situation now where somehow Black people were going to be your equals. Incomprehensible. I don't even want to live that way, you see. So these things are very important to understand. And that's the way it was in the Civil War. People who were involved in the war effort, people who were politicians, people who were activists for the Southern cause. This was absolutely devastating, and it lasts the longest shadow over this nation's history than anything else, right? I mean, Vietnam cast a long shadow over our history, but it wasn't like the Civil War, because the Civil War wasn't a foreign war. A Civil War was a war between us and us, you see. Unless that's the thing here at the end of the Civil War lecture, right? We've got today and we've got Reconstruction coming up next time. But I want people now, because by the time that the Atlanta campaign was on, and then we get to the end of the war at Appomattox in '65, the Southern people knew that they were pretty much toast, you see. So it brings us another thing about, well, when do you quit fighting? And what happened to all of that emotional fervor you had of keeping the war going because you really believed in it that much, you see? 700,000 people had already died at a minimum, not even including civilian casualties by the time you got to Appomattox. With that kind of bloodshed, there are two impulses. Number one, I mean, if you're the South, there are two impulses. Number one is to say, let's find a way to get rid of further bloodshed, because it's just not rational to keep going like this if we're going to lose anyway. And the second thing that comes to mind is like, well, now that we've lost all of these people, they shouldn't die in vain. And therefore, we have to continue the effort. Now, if you're going to continue the effort, once the Civil War is lost, I mean, where are you going to go? Mexico, right? And there were many people that went to Mexico. You had people who went to Canada. You had people who reinvented themselves in Europe, right? Because now that the Civil War was lost, you literally had to start over, but it would have been too painful to start over here where it was lost. You had to create a new reality. This was something that created a division for us easily well into the up until the First World War. You might consider the First World War where you had, I'm skipping over the Spanish-American War, I'm going straight to the First World War, where you have now troops coming together like they did in World War II to go over to Europe in the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, under General Pershing. And imagine all of those people together in the troop transport or the ship or the train or the barracks. And you had people from, let's say they were from Atlanta or they were from Boston. The Civil War was still going on. It was still palpably felt between all of those people that were involved in those things. You probably know people in your lifetime that have that bear out what I'm talking about, the little bit of apprehension, a little bit of tension, the self-identity as far as a group of what it means to be part of the defeated versus the vanquished versus the victor, you see. And it was a big deal. We're going to talk about this next time. That's going to be our subject, is how do you put the country back together? How do you put something together that has been permanently broken? And you might even ask the question philosophically or even politically, has it ever been put back together? So what is the situation when we have the last year of the war? So we have Generals Sherman in the South, as far as the Union is concerned. General Sherman is very famous, of course, because of the type of warfare that he brought to not only the Civil War, but the world, right? General Sherman is somebody who was considered to be the first modern general. Now, he knew Grant and was actually pals with Grant in the sense of familiarity. You see, Sherman and Grant had some commonalities as far as being outcasts. They were both from the Western theater of war, you see. So one of the things I want to make a division on right now, even in the Union Army, was that in the eastern part of the war, the parts that were typically fought in Pennsylvania and Virginia, right? That was considered the primary theater of operations, you see. And the more famous people were there. People like McClellan, people like Lee, the Army of the Potomac, the Army of Northern Virginia. The Western War, the one that was fought around the Mississippi, west of the Mississippi, was much lesser known, right, in the history books. It is even in the popular conscience. I'll give you an example. Like when I teach World War II history, right, people know very little about, unless you were there or you have some interest in it, of course. They know much less about the Mediterranean theater of operations or Africa than they do about the Northern European operations, D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, right? And all the rest of that going on up north. Same thing in the Pacific War. I mean, the Central Pacific War with the United States Navy, and you have MacArthur and all of that, right? And then, but people know less about the China, Burma, India theater, which was very important, of course. You see, so we have that in any kind of a study. But General Sherman and General Grant were both outcasts, right? Grant had had a reputation, as you probably already know, for drinking, and he was a binge drinker. He missed his wife terribly. I'm not making an excuse for him. I'm a licensed alcohol counselor and abuse counselor, substance abuse counselor. And so I'm not making excuses for Grant, more like explaining it. He drank because he was lonely. And apparently he was a functioning drunk. And he had that reputation. So people were reluctant to accept him when President Lincoln actually made him in charge of the whole army. He said, "Don't you know that Grant is a drunk?" And Lincoln famously came back. Lincoln was great when the one-liners, the first one-line comebacks, good stuff, Lincoln. And he said, "Well, Lincoln may be, Grant may be a drunk. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to find out what he's drinking, and I want you to send a bottle to every one of my other generals." You see, that was Lincoln, because Lincoln was exasperated that his generals were not taking the battle to the enemy, that Lee, because they were the underdog, had more spirit, had more will, right? They were more invested in their cause, you see, and that's what you need. And it brings up another philosophical point, that you just can't win a war with better material or more material. You actually have to have the will to succeed. You have to have the will to want to win, you see? And whoever has that will, unless they're completely overwhelmed by the other side, well, the side with the will is going to have the tenacity to do the job, you see? And it seemed like Lee was the one who had the will until Grant came along. He was a very, very good general. And so the point about Sherman, and why was Sherman an outcast? Well, Sherman at one point actually was thought to be mentally ill, crazy, you see. And well, I guess he was the right kind of crazy, all right? Now, there's a lot of people, we don't know all of these years later exactly what the diagnosis of these people were. For instance, take Lincoln, for example. Lincoln, by modern standards, is presumed to have at least be a major depressive, or probably a manic depressive, right? Now, they didn't have those kind of terms back in those days, of course. It was called, what a depressive was called back in the time of the 19th century was he had melancholy, right? That's what it was called, right? And as far as Sherman goes, who knows? Maybe he was a bipolar also. I really don't know. It doesn't mean that these people can't function. In many cases, people with bipolar disorder can function better than other people if they can harness the mania and make good use of the depression, right? If anybody wants to know what the hell I'm talking about, I'll be glad to do another 7-part series on that, all right? But for those of you who might have had this, then you'll probably understand what I'm talking about right off, all right? But Sherman, he had a famous quote also, and he says that, General Grant and I, we get along famously because I don't bother him about his drinking, and he doesn't bother me about being crazy, you see? And so there you had it. So by this last year of the war now, Sherman and Grant are in the Eastern Theater of Operations, North and South, all right? Now, Sherman sets out to take Atlanta. And he does, of course, as you know. But what was the strategic goal of Atlanta? Was Atlanta a big military target? The fighting was up north. I mean, if you're going to win a war by defeating the enemy's soldiers, well, the war wasn't down south. The war was up north. It was in Virginia, you see. That's where Lee was. You see, and that's what makes this part of this lecture very interesting for those of you who are, military history buffs, and I'll assume that you are, is that Sherman created a new way of looking at war, which today historians or military analysts call total war. And what that means is, it's not enough to actually destroy an enemy's army or their navy. What really needs to be done is to crack the emotional backbone of your enemy's will to fight. And it's very important to understand, you see. And it wasn't just that, but that was the new part of it. You see, total war. Now, in World War II, to give you an example, and this is still highly controversial right to this day, is the difference between, for instance, the air war from England over Germany with our heavy bombers, right? So you had American bombers and you had the British bombers, right? The British bombed during the daytime. The Americans bombed during the daytime. The British bombed at night, right? And but the strategy, at least at the beginning of the war, was very different. The Americans versus the British. The British, Sir Arthur Harris, said, "What is the difference if we fly to Germany with our bombers and we find an oil refinery, or we find a power plant, or we find a Messerschmitt factory where the Germans are manufacturing fighter planes?" You see, all of those three things that I just mentioned are what are called legitimate military targets. You see, they're manufacturing war goods. So therefore, it's legitimate to bomb them. And whoever gets killed is in the production of war equipment against us. And well, it's just collateral damage, whoever gets killed in there, right? So that is the way we looked at it. And the Americans sought to up until 1944 anyway, we sought to destroy military targets, primarily at least. The British had a different point of view under Sir Arthur Harris. He said, Sir Arthur Harris is like, why don't we just bomb the entire town? In other words, kill everybody, right? And his point of view, in psychology, of course, in regular life, we call this a rationalization, right? He said that, well, if we have to target a factory that is heavily defended with anti-aircraft fire, and it's going to cause us a lot of extra casualties because a military target is heavily defended, why put ourselves at the extra expense and the extra loss? Why don't we bomb the town where all of these people are sleeping during the night before they go back to work, and kill them all while they're in bed? Wouldn't that equally stop production at the factory? You see the difference? Now, Sherman was the first one in history, military history, to bring this kind of thinking to bear. Now, the operation to go down to Atlanta, and then what is usually referred to as Sherman's March to the Sea, was like this idea, like, why don't we just cut a 60-mile swath from Atlanta to the Atlantic Ocean? And not only will it thoroughly demoralize the South and make the average Southern person realize that even their own army, General Lee and all of the other secondary armies, they can't even protect their own people in the heart of the Confederacy. You see, so it was psychological in nature, you see? So if the Southern people, if the heart of the Confederacy in the South, from Atlanta down to South Carolina, where the war started, South Carolina was the first state to renege its agreement, its ratification of the Constitution, and secede, as we say, from the Union. If the Southern people, if you and I were standing there tending to our cows or something, and we were Confederates, and it was absolutely clear to us that General Sherman he could do whatever he wanted in the heart of the Confederacy. And our troops, the Confederate troops, our Confederate army was literally powerless to stop it. What would that do to our willingness to carry on the war? What would that do to our confidence? What would that do to our, sensibility? Our willingness to fight and sacrifice more. You see, so that's what Sherman brought to military history. And that's what the March to the Sea was about. Now, at least that's the new part about it. The part that makes more traditional sense is that, number one, Sherman was going to basically live off the land. And that was something also that was very, very new. And because nobody in the Civil War was a modern war for its day. In the same way that we have cruise missiles and lasers and radars and all of that panoply of modern, postmodern stuff, right? New age postmodern stuff that hypersonic missiles and God knows what else, satellites. The Civil War was a modern war, as I mentioned to you in a couple of previous lectures. We had the telegraph, which literally gave Lincoln almost immediate battle accounting of what was going on at the front, wherever that happened to be. And also you were able to transport your troops from one place to the next because maybe you held a rail line, you see? And then troops and equipment and cannons were all carried by rail to a new location. This had never been done in warfare before, unless we're talking about something like the Boer War. And what Sherman was going to do was he was going to abandon his supply train. I mean, he's got a big army. He collected all kinds of smaller armies to make a larger army, Sherman did, by the time he got to Atlanta. So the question is, strategically, is that in warfare, you always have to watch out how far you get into an enemy territory, because the further away you get from your territory, it means that your enemy, because since now you're on his court, so to speak, they can surround you and go behind you and cut off your supply line. You see, think about this strategically, right? Now, the best example of this in modern warfare would be the first time that Hitler was defeated in World War II, you see, where he brought his troops into Russia, right? And Russia is an enormous place, absolutely is, like the Pacific Ocean of a continent, and Hitler went into Russia, and he only had a certain amount of time before the winter was going to set in and all the rest of that. But he was so confident, Hitler was, that he was going to be able to grab Moscow, right, and Stalingrad and all these other key strategic locations. But what happened was that the Russians waited for the winter to set in, and the Germans were so spread out that the Russians now on their territory, their equipment was designed for cold weather, and they were able to literally encircle the Germans, who were now so far away from their original supply lines that they actually suffered enormous defeat in Russia. You see, so when Sherman came down into the heart of the Confederacy, right? The normal thing to think about was like, well, now the Confederacy can actually surround him, cut him off from his supply lines, and we're going to actually lay a siege on Sherman's army and cause them to run out of food and equipment and all the rest of that. So another thing that Sherman did, which was brand new in this part of the war, was that he understood that he was going to abandon the control of what was behind him. And he was going to live off the land. His army was going to live off the land. And it's something that the Confederacy didn't expect because it was non-traditional in this sense, you see? So Sherman took this not as a logistical problem, that he didn't have this continuous railroad supply line behind him that he had to take part of his army to protect. Remember, as far into new territory as you get, the more of your army you have to use to protect your railroad. You see, what he did, Sherman, was he abandoned that whole idea. And he didn't need any of his troops to protect the railroad because he just abandoned what was behind him. And so how do you feed an army of several 100,000 people? You live off the land. You see, so that 60-mile swath from Atlanta to the coast, you come across a lot of stuff, right? Cows, dairy, food, factories, ammunition, all the rest of these things that people lived off of down there. Well, Sherman said, now we're living off of it. And sorry, homeowner, or sorry, factory worker, you know, all of this belongs to us now, you see. And this was a very brand new thing in the Civil War, right? So he became this mobile raiding force, right? And that was very, very modern stuff. It was used, it's used today in strategy. All right, Sherman was a pioneer in this regard. So he sought to humiliate the South. He sought to make the South feel as though there was no possible way they could win the war. And he also was going to cut the swath straight to the Atlantic Ocean and split the Confederacy from everything that was above southern North Carolina and everything that was below southern North Carolina, right? And see, so you're going to divide the states even further. Now, the Confederacy was already split by this time of the war. And the Mississippi River was an essential delineation in the Confederacy, you see. And if I had more time to talk about naval history last week, or 2 weeks ago, I'm sorry, I would have talked about the Battle of Mobile Bay and all the rest of this. And it was all about the control of the Mississippi, which means that you have to be in, of course, the Gulf of Mexico for that, around Louisiana. And so once the Mississippi was held and controlled by the North, that means that everything west of the Mississippi was essentially split off from everything that was east of the Mississippi. And not only that, but remember, the South, to even survive, had to be able to bring contraband goods out of the Confederacy and into the Confederacy. Now, the part about that I was going to talk about was last week, you know, in why the South had ships and why the North had ships and what they were both trying to do, as far as the South trying to break out of this blockade. And the reason for the blockade was essentially to strangle the South. So the South couldn't export and they couldn't import. And that would cause them to not be able to sell their products. It would cause them to be not have any money. It would cause them not to have any influence anywhere. You know, so you had these Confederate raiders who were successful, but that was just raiders. You know, you had a ship here and there, and you had these little expeditions here and there. Now, one of the ways that the South got stuff to other places was through the Mississippi River, going north, you see, even to places in Canada. So the Confederacy is split now from the Mississippi on west, right? Remember, Texas was the most intact state left in the Confederacy. You see, but they were hampered by the fact, and we call this lines of communication, the Mississippi became a massive division between what was west of the Mississippi and east, right? So you can see the point there. And once that Sherman went across from Atlanta all the way to the coast, then everything south of that line was cut off also. You see, so what you had here is everything north of, in the northeast part of the Confederacy, was now the theater of operations, right? The upper part of South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, especially. This is what we're talking about now. And it is effectively isolated. Now, there's still a Southern Army that is trying to parallel Sherman, right? And that was General Johnson. But Sherman had outnumbered him and outflanked him and everything else. Now the real battleground comes. The real battleground comes in the north, in Virginia, right? Now keep in mind also that one of the tactical features of what Sherman did in his march to the sea and Atlanta, right, was literally the breadbasket where the Southern Army got anything, right? Imagine the kind of leather goods that were required to run an army back in those days, saddles and boots and, you know, all of the other accoutrements and everything else like that, you see? And, you know, once again, to use an example that might make more sense, you know, in 20th century terms, you know, at the end of World War II, the only nation that hadn't been thoroughly bombed was the United States. I mean, Great Britain during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz had been heavily hit. Germany obviously was in a state of ruin, and so many other places also. There was no real industrial base that any of these countries had to really produce things after World War II, not the way that the United States did. Okay, the United States, because we had ramped up so much during World War II, and we still had the industrial capacity here to do it. We emerged from World War II as the only nation that can actually shift gears from military equipment to consumer equipment and supply the burgeoning post-war world, you see. One of the reasons why we were able to pay off our massive borrowed war debt, you know, that's one of the major differences between then and now, is that now, even though we equally have a very large debt, not to the degree that we had then, even by 1940s money, we have so much competition in the form of certainly China and India and all of these other places that weren't these massive global trading competitors, manufacturing and trading competitors. You see, the United States isn't in the place that it was. So you can see that the South was in trouble. They didn't have, because of Sherman especially, they didn't have that breadbasket anymore from the South. They didn't have the leather works. They didn't have the ammunition. They didn't have the foundries, right? A foundry, if you don't know, is a place where you melt metal and pour it into casts and create things like guns and cannons and other things made out of cast iron or wrought iron, right? And the South had to make do what it had. You see, Sherman made sure that General Lee's army had no fresh provisions, had no fresh supplies, was short on ammunition. You see, this is a big deal, right? Sherman had done to the South what Allied bombing had done to Germany, essentially, right? In that was the analogy I was trying to make a minute ago, you see? And so that certainly makes your army in a desperate state. You know, you can live off of your willpower only so long. Once everybody is hungry and once you're running out of ammunition, now you're in a suicide fight, you see? And that suicide thing really wasn't in the Western consciousness. You know, I mean, we weren't suicidal and neither was the South as far as individual capacity. The first time the Americans ran into a cultural difference that actually prioritized the dignity and honor of death over that of life was when we encountered kamikazes in World War II, you see, and it's something that is not, it doesn't really resonate with the Western consciousness because we're kind of life-centric, you know? So when we encountered kamikazes in World War II, Japanese who had essentially chosen to be with their glorious ancestors by killing themselves, hopefully taking as many Americans with them as possible, that's not something that the way we normally think in the Western canon of thought, or at least as it existed until very recently. So the Southern people, they were coming to the point where, you know, the average person even didn't think we could win this war. You see, so it led to an awful states of desperation as far as thought, as far as, I mean, people were depressed, they were hungry, they were humiliated, they were angry as hell, right? Because anybody who thinks they're on the winning side of something is usually contemptuous of the other side. And now you had the people who you were contemptuous of, the Northerners, that essentially were going to win. And now you've got a situation like one I was talking about before. It's like, who wants to live in a world where people who love Black people are going to be in charge of us, right? People who love the over-industrialization and the value of the dollar over honor and dignity and tradition, they're going to be in charge of us, right? Our entire glorious lifestyle down here in the South of being the epitome of Western civilization, you know, the Southerners felt as though they had the best of everything that people had come to, for want of a better term, the New World for. You see, they had embodied the class structure of Europe, which you had the elites or the entitlement class, if you will. And then you had essentially not much of a middle class, but essentially a working class, right? Obviously in the South, it was legal to have these slaves, which was the extreme expression of the working class, right? And but they were happy and felt as though they were entitled to be part of the entitled class, right? Because we are better. We are entitled. We are educated. We do have culture. We do have honor. What are we going to do now that we've lost the war? The North is going to bring their way of life down to the South, and we now are going to be infected with this kind of gritty industrialism that you see in northern cities. There's no honor, there's no dignity, there's no culture. It's just a bunch of people who are automatons going to work every day in a factory to manufacture mass-produced goods. And where is the culture? You see, now, my point I'm bringing this up is that we are right now at the beginning of time of something else coming up in Europe in the mind of what's probably a political genius called Karl Marx, Marx and Engels, who are actually taking the events going on in Germany specifically, but also as a parallel sense of what's going on in the United States in this now second industrial revolution. And Marx and Engels were making the same argument that the Southern people were saying, is that, I mean, to different ends, but he's saying that the North in any industrialized country it's not good for the workers, you see? It's not good for the workers because of this new thing we have called automation and steam engine power and all the rest of that, right? Now, of course, for the South wasn't interested in, that kind of Marxism from that standpoint, but it was simultaneous that the Southern states were lamenting the loss of their cultured lifestyle to what was going to be inevitable of the industrialized North, which was just going to turn the South into another, cesspool. You see, this is the kind of thinking that was on the minds of most people. You see, it was very, very difficult. The South and the North were culturally very, very different. And of course, the war made it that much more different, because to endure something, you've got to dig even deeper into what made you believe what you were believing to begin with, just so you could get through it, right? So the Southern people were not like, well, I'm glad that's over with, and let's go and be friends with our friends in the North anymore. I mean, you're talking about two different countries now, with a tremendous amount of resentment. And after 700,000 people have been killed, there is no way that this genie's going back in the bottle, you see? And that was the challenge, even at this point, even before Appomattox. And we'll talk about that more in Reconstruction. But after Sherman's march to the sea, particularly, he had demonstrated to the Southern states, which was his intention, that the war essentially was unwinnable, while simultaneously depriving General Lee and Lee's other subsidiary armies of everything they needed to sustain themselves. You see, as far as Atlanta is concerned specifically, did you have to burn Atlanta? Did you have to take Atlanta? Well, Atlanta was the heart, in many cases, of the Confederacy. The capital, of course, was in Richmond, but the spiritual center, right, the so-called untouchable part of the South, the Deep South, was really Atlanta. And it was a rail hub where a lot of railroads went into it. But it was a psychological thing that Sherman had done. For instance, what's a good example here? After the landings in June 6, 1944, right? When the British, the Canadians, and the Americans, and 10 other smaller groups, right? The Free French, et cetera, the Poles, land on Normandy. Right, what is the goal? The goal is to go to Germany, right, and sort of like rout the Germans out of France. So the question I'm getting to is, was it necessary to take Paris? No, not as a military target, it wasn't. I mean, what is liberating Paris going to do for the military operation and the strategic goal of routing the Germans out of France back to the German frontier and then into Germany, where hopefully they'll capitulate, you see? No, you liberated Paris. Well, it was a deviation from the strategic goal of winning the war, but it was very necessary psychologically, because Paris became the epicenter of, obviously, the Germans are going to lose. You see, when you liberate Paris, right, that means that now France has triumphed, the Allies have triumphed, and the Germans are doomed. It's a psychological thing. And And that's what Sherman did with Atlanta. Did he have to burn Atlanta? Well, technically, he didn't want to leave anything there that the Southerners could use, right? Did he have to burn everything? No, probably not. But he wanted to make a point. It was the opposite point about liberating Paris. He was going to destroy it. And that's what he did. You see, and that was Sherman. Now, a lot of people look back on Sherman. They say he's a madman. I don't think you're going to get anybody from the South to say, well, I kind of understood what Sherman did and all the rest of that. And once again, you know that a little example I used before about World War I, about now you have all these people in the troop transports, and the guy over here is from Louisiana, and this guy's from Atlanta, and you're from Boston or New York or something like that. I mean, these guys were still the Southerners, and you're still a Yankee, you see? And these people over there remember Uncle Bob, who remembers people from his life that were in the damn Civil War, and he's still a little pissed off, you see? How do you think in World War II, all of these Southern fellows felt driving around in these mass-produced tanks called Sherman tanks? Just a small point, but you see what I'm getting at? So it wasn't until the end of World War II where we had these forced commonalities, you know, that brought us to a certain point. I mean, I think if it wasn't for World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, even some things that were generally speaking great equalizers, I think that would be still even further off as far as reintegration of societies from the North and South. So Sherman makes it to the coast, and then he makes a left turn north. Now this affects now what's going on in the northeastern part of the country, right? The Confederacy, Virginia, where the war is going to end at Appomattox, okay? Lee knows what's going on in the South. He knows that Sherman has just, with complete impunity, unstoppable, has just like sawed the South in half all the way to South Carolina. And now he's free to turn north, and he is now going to join General Grant to create this massive unstoppable force. All right, so that is the strategic situation, you see? So Lee now is under a lot of pressure, you might imagine. What is Lee going to do? Lee is already, he is tied down, and so is Grant for that matter, of trying to protect Petersburg, of trying to protect Richmond, you see, because that, of course, Richmond is the capital, you know, and siege warfare takes up a lot of men and material and everything else like that. And you can't maneuver, right? So Sherman had created something brand new. He's free to maneuver because he's not tied down to anything, right? What General Patton did when he had the Third Army from Normandy in 1944 all the way to the German frontier, Patton was the embodiment of Sherman, right? Patton was going to do and did across France and Germany what Sherman did going across from Atlanta to the coast. You see, these things have very specific parallels. Sherman is a seminal figure in our country's history from the standpoint of from a military standpoint, and in world military history also. The Germans in their Blitzkrieg plan, right, which means lightning war in 1940, to actually run out of Germany and then make sure that you flatten Holland and Luxembourg and Belgium, and then get to France very fast. You see, that was something that actually borrowed elements from Sherman. You see, And also, if you compare it to World War I, the way you had this bogged down trench lines was they didn't have the mechanization and everything was going so slowly that one side was able to equalize the other until they were both paralyzed. And having the experience of World War I, the Germans, Hitler didn't want to see that happen again. So he was going to overwhelm the other side in their complacency, if you will, until the other side had a chance to react or reacted effectively. You see, but you see the elements of Sherman in all of this. So now Lee is looking at his strategic plan and he's saying, well, all right, well, Sherman now, who has gained strength like a snowball going downhill, you see, momentum, force, and he's unstoppable, is now going to turn north and join forces with General Grant. And we up here in Virginia are going to get crushed. So what does Lee do? I mean, he's not ready to surrender. You know, nobody, after losing 700,000 people, and he didn't lose 700,000 people. 700,000 was the aggregate for both sides. Okay, so split that in half when I'm talking in these terms. And Lee isn't ready to give up. He is excellent in maneuver warfare, and he is going to outmaneuver Grant, but Grant now is in a position where his army is freshly fed, they're highly trained, they have a solid logistical supply line behind them, and Lee, they have to stop and they have to go and they have to take a day off from the war, 2 days off of the war, just so his troops can go out into the field and kill a goose so they would have something to eat, or forage for berries, or find local farmhouses, or fish, you see? So what's happened now is that General Grant's ability to be supplied logistically and Sherman and Grant's ability to deny those very same things to Lee's army are really having their effect now. They're really having their effect. It demoralizes the Southern troops. They're ragtag more and more. They don't have replacement uniforms. By the time of Appomattox, there wasn't one Confederate soldier who was wearing a whole Confederate uniform. I mean, everybody had mixed and matched, and they were wearing all of these patchwork of everything. You know, they were running on honor. They were running on willpower, you see? And here's another psychological thing for you. We never really had to think about this too much, certainly as Americans, and especially Yankee Americans. And you probably might even see where I'm going with this. If your country was attacked, it would give you a certain kind of power to want to fight the attackers, the interlopers, the aggressors. You see, that gives you a certain sense of willpower, of the intrusion of it, the rape of it. You see, where you've got more psychological and heart energy than the actual invaders, right? The invaders might have greater firepower, more bullets, more food, whatever, but you're angrier. So you see the kind of power this has, right? And the South, they saw themselves as being invaded. They saw themselves as being raped. They saw themselves as being abused. And don't forget the age of chivalry, right? You have certain kinds of ways of inspiring people to fight that lasted up until, in our popular consciousness, up until very recently, right? When I do my World War II presentations, etc., there's a myriad of posters that you can use um, for recruitment, for morale, you see, and many of them, they would depict, this is all considered highly racist now, of course, and but you would pick, if you had a Japanese person, right? So you want to get somebody to enlist in the Marine Corps, right? So you got a Japanese guy on the poster, and of course his skin is yellow, and he's got slanty eyes, and he's got these big Coke bottle glasses and buck teeth, and every possible caricature you can imagine. And he looks very, very sinister, and he's got his dagger at the throat of what looks like your sister. You see, this is the way it's done. Right now, what decent, red-blooded, God-fearing American boy isn't going to give his own life to kill that monster who's about to have his way with your sister, your mother? You see? This was kind of like the same thing in a sense. You had during any war, you've got, I mean, just the fact that somebody, if I came home today and I was locked out of my house and there was a whole bunch of other people in my house, okay, and they're eating my food and they're watching my TV, and then they're in there having their way with my wife or something like that. I mean, even more so. I mean, you think I'd be a little angry here? You think I'd be a little outraged? Well, try to put that into a mass kind of psychology and think about what's really going on here. That's the way it is. So I'm talking about motivation, and we're talking about what makes really people want to continue to fight when our rational minds say, look, we've already lost, right? Remember the end of Gone with the Wind, where Rhett Butler has decided that now, after all of this recalcitrance, after all of this cynicism and everything else about how stupid it was for the Southerners to think that they could get into the war and win in 6 months or whatever it was and come home in this glorious celebration of victory, right? Right, Rhett Butler knew better. But here now at the end, after the whole thing's lost, he is now telling, right? He is now saying, oh, well, I'm going to join the war effort. Right? I'm going to join, and right? So it's like, but the war's lost. And then he says, if you remember the movie, well, that's okay. I've always had a thing for lost causes anyway. This is what you want to understand, okay? And that's what it was. But Rhett, I love you. Well, my dear, that's your misfortune. But where will I go? What will I do? Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. So Grant now is going to start chasing Lee, right? Lee has to kind of give up his defense of Richmond. It's lost. And Lee is going to try to go west from Richmond. And he is going to try to hook up somehow by going south. He's going to go west away from Grant, and then he's going to go south and try to hook up with the remnants of the force by Johnson, who was the one who was shadowing Sherman, you see? And they're hoping, so Johnson and Lee are hoping to meet up. But now General Grant knows exactly what he's going to do because he's looking at the same map that Lee is. Remember, these two were trained in the same exact place. They both went to West Point. They were both American military officers. They both understood Napoleonic maneuver warfare. Napoleonic maneuver warfare, right? So if you're looking at a map, And the other side is looking at a map. It's the same map. And, you know, there's only so many things that are the possibility to do that make military sense. So when the options that Lee had available to him at this time were something that wasn't hard for Grant to figure out. So Lee essentially made sure, Grant made sure that Lee couldn't go too far west and then hook up south. What Grant did was he started running west too to make sure that Lee couldn't go south. And remember now, Lee's army is running out of food. They got nothing to eat. Their soldiers are exhausted. And there's a number of skirmishes, a number of battles. The Confederates acquit themselves very well, but it is essentially hopeless. The threat of Sherman now being this entity to come north unfettered and joining Grant is already going to add to this massive, overwhelming force that Lee is already facing because of Grant at this point. He can't go south, Lee, and meet up with Johnson. He can't, because Grant keeps outflanking Lee's attempt to outflank him. It's hopeless. And they've moved west now to a place of Richmond. Now the Appomattox River is there, and there's this place called Appomattox Courthouse. And Grant sends out feelers to Lee, basically saying, you know, I think it's time to surrender. And Lee is in a position where he understands that any kind of resistance at this point is going to not result in his victory. It is only going to kill another couple of 100,000 people. So Lee and Grant agreed to meet at this location, and it was Appomattox Courthouse, and it was this house, you know, with a porch on it. It's a historical site. You can go see it. Maybe you already have seen it, you know. I remember my mother always telling me that, oh, we took you to Gettysburg and all of that. I said, I don't remember. Oh, we had a great time. I said, how old was I, Mom? She says, well, you were, let's see, you were about 7 months old. And I said, it's a big joke, you know, because it's like I didn't remember, you know. And so Lee now is there, meets with Grant. And Grant is starting off with some kind of, I don't know, what I guess you could call small talk, right? So Grant says to Lee, you know, I remember meeting you, sir, very respectful. I remember meeting you when we were both in the Mexican-American War, you see, and there was this one time where you, Lee, had to come over and see these officers, and I was on the staff of that officer, and we met for a minute, you see. And Lee makes it a point to tell Grant, well, I don't remember you at all, right? He literally throws shade on him. He insults him, you know, by saying that you are so insignificant that I didn't even remember you, even though you're telling me that you remembered me, you see? And Grant, by the way, you know, it's another pit of optics here. Look at the optics. Lee shows up like resplendent in a new uniform, right? With yellow sash and all of the, you know, everything shined up, you know, and polished boots and everything else like that. Lee shows up resplendent. Grant shows up in his service uniform with mud on it, and it's all wrinkled up, right? Now, there's another parallel to this that General MacArthur uses at the end of World War II. September 2nd, 1945, you've all seen those pictures on the deck of the quarterdeck, as it were, of the Missouri. And the Japanese are coming up It's going to mark not only the surrender of Japan, but of course, the end of World War II. And the Japanese are coming up and they're, and the diplomats had their diplomat outfits on, the shiny hats and the tails and the long coats and the striped pants and all the rest of that stuff that diplomats wore. And General MacArthur orders the uniform of the day of all of the Americans and the British that were there too, to be the regular uniform of the day, right? Which were essentially amounted to these wrinkled up khakis. You see the psychological warfare here? It was direct take that MacArthur did from General Grant and Lee at Appomattox. Very, very powerful stuff. So Lee is given terms by Grant, and this sets the stage for the rest of the 19th century. Okay, right there on that spot, because right there on that spot, Grant wanted to make sure that he didn't humiliate Lee, even though he could have, right? Essentially, you have the victors and the vanquished. And historically, the vanquished were vanquished. You see, and the victors could do whatever they wanted because they had won, so the hell with you. And yeah, we're taking your stuff. And yeah, we are going to eat the stuff in your refrigerator. Not that they had refrigerators. I'm making a rhetorical point. And we're going to drink your beer. And by the way, we're going to have our way with your wife and your daughter. You see? And there's not a damn thing you can do about it because you lost. And you deserve it because a year ago in this battle, you killed my brother, and I'm pissed off. You see, that's the way warfare always was. But Grant does something here that has never been done before. Because remember, this isn't another country you're fighting. It is your brethren, essentially, as Americans. Even at this juncture, the whole point was for the Union to put the Union back together. So at the surrender there at Appomattox, Grant is already laying the foundation for Reconstruction by not humiliating Lee, right? By these gestures. Lee had this, with all of his shined up stuff that he brought with him that day, he had this magnificent sword in a scabbard, right? And it would have been traditional for Grant to take the thing. But Grant wanted to make sure, as a gesture, that he let Lee have his sword, right? So that, letting Lee go out of that courthouse with his sword was just, it maintained his sense of honor, his sense of, taking his sword is like castrating somebody, essentially, effectively. You see what I mean? He wanted to make sure that Lee left with his honor and his dignity. It's another thing that marks the American Civil War. Yes, Lincoln would have had a part in the terms of surrender, but Lincoln is going to be dead in a few days, okay? Another fascinating question about these things about Lincoln, because Lincoln, what would have looked like had Lincoln not been assassinated as far as Reconstruction is concerned, right? It's the same question in a parallel sense to, like, what would the 1960s and the Vietnam War would have looked like had John F. Kennedy not been assassinated and was still president instead of Lyndon Baines Johnson, right? All very good questions. Now, Lincoln, let me go back to my story. So Grant allows, what are the terms of surrender? What are the terms of surrender? Well, essentially, as a Southern officer or a Southern soldier, all you had to do was realign yourself with the United States of America and go home. That's it. Right? If you brought your own horse, you got to take your horse home. If you have your own gun, you got to take your gun home. Just go home. Right? There's no punishment. There's no retribution. There's no, as we say where I come from, no nothing. There's just, the war's over, go home. And kind of like, and sin no more, right? That was it. Unheard of. That was it. So the idea is for the Southerners to be able to have their dignity and not get further humiliated, which is just going to add to the desire to have some kind of a breakout, you know, well, we're not giving up, you know, kind of a thing. Very, very important right at this juncture. Now, we have probably the best example of this particular situation, using another example into a more modern conflict, right, was once again World War I, which obviously was a European war. And major combatants, you know, for the sake of argument, the British, the French, and the Germans, right? We're an associated power. And so is Japan, by the way, if you didn't know that. I'll tell you that story another time. But the big mistake at the end of World War I was that particularly the French, were so revengeful to the Germans in the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, that it literally left Germany in a state of such humiliation and poverty that it immediately sowed the seeds for the next war before the ink was dry on that treaty. You see? Now that was the Europeans, and the Europeans, even Wilson was having a hard time. Our President Wilson. Wilson came over with all of these very Enlightenment ideas, right? Lincoln was a real, not Lincoln, Wilson, beg your pardon. Wilson was he was the real first 20th century progressive. And he came in with this lofty notion that was basically like, if only we think about it or dream it, it was like creative imagination or creative imaging, right? Why don't we have a world that isn't going to have any warfare anymore? And this is what we have to do, right? And the Europeans basically laughed at him, right? And his peace plan was never adopted. As a matter of fact, the United States of America never even ratified the Treaty of Versailles. We never became part of the League of Nations, which was supposed to prevent the next war. And the Germans were seething at what the victorious powers had made them endure, made it completely possible for somebody like Adolf Hitler to become the voice of that and the demagogue of it, you see? And you see the parallels in all of this, you know, but that was a European war, and that's the way the Europeans always did it. And the Europeans always considered themselves different than the Americans. They had to differentiate themselves from us and us to them in many regards, right? More sociology, more, you know, do we need to have a nation? Do we need to have a flag to fight under? Do we have to belong to something, even if it's the wrong thing, right? All of those things another day. So the war is over. Lincoln's dead a few days later, right? He's dead by this guy, John Wilkes Booth, who sees Lincoln as the reason why his beloved South, the Confederacy, is now going to be disbanded. It has to go away. And now we're all going to be like the Northerners, right? Like the black hugging Northerners with their greed and their factories and is going to be the end of all good things. So of course he kills Lincoln. And now there's a new president. You know, Lincoln, another point with Lincoln, right, was, you know, Lincoln was giving these overtures where it was, you know, the whole thing with the 13th Amendment, right? In other words, saying that slavery is legal. That was really just a war measure that we were doing, right? And the Emancipation Proclamation, that was really just a war measure we were doing. You know, the thing is with Lincoln, right, is that even though he abhorred slavery, what he set out to do in the Civil War was not to end slavery. He set out to bring the Union back together primarily, and then, you know, the abolition of slavery actually became a secondary issue, which then in the popular mind became the primary issue, you see. So to the question that was asked about what would Lincoln have done. But one of the legacies of the Civil War, of course, I mean, if there wasn't a Civil War, how would we have remembered Lincoln, right? Lincoln is consistently the most popular president. It considered the new generation of the founding father generation, you see, more venerated than Washington or anybody else, you know. And Lincoln had a way of putting things into words where it was, when I was talking about manic depressive illness before, I mean, if you can harness your depression, which will give you a kind of like a mental and emotional depth, right? If any of you have been depressed, if you're actually able to harness those thoughts or do something with it, you wind up with some very thoughtful, deep stuff. That was Lincoln. And he put something down, to give you an example of Lincoln. Probably the most famous 2 minutes in oratory history, right? Not then, now, to me. And this was at the scene of the Gettysburg battlefield, to actually dedicate a cemetery there, right? And watch, in like 2.5 minutes, I'm going to read it more slowly, how Lincoln embodies such a deep message that went completely, you know, nobody even recognized it at the moment. You know, it was kind of like, well, what a lousy little speech. You know, I mean, you know, and the guy before him talked for like a long time, you know, but I have kind of like an appreciation for people who speak less with more meaning than have people just with this manufactured kind of boilerplate chatter that is just meaningless. Watch this. Here is Lincoln. One of the legacies of the Civil War is Lincoln, right? And I think that the Civil War essentially drove him into a deeper state of introspection and grief and turmoil, right? So for me, this is kind of a silver lining, just having his oratory. Address at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This was in 1863. "Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or to detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of our program today. I look forward to seeing you next time for our last installment in this series, which is about Reconstruction. Thank you. Turn on your mic.
There we go. What I'm gonna do now is stop the recording.